Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. Let me tell you about the most expensive mistake my neighbor ever made. This happened about 6 months ago and just wrapped up in court last week. Still can't believe how far this guy went over a water tank. Some background first. I own a small ranch, about 20 acres in a semi-rural area. Nothing fancy, just a working property where I raise heritage sheep and maintain a small apple orchard. It's honest work that requires a reliable water source, which is why I invested in a 5,000-gallon black polyethylene storage tank mounted on a concrete pad. The whole setup is properly fenced off with the pump equipment and filled from my own permitted well that was drilled years ago. The tank sits about 300 yards from my house, near the barn and utility area. It's not exactly pretty to look at, but it gets the job done and everything is completely legal and up to code. The county has all the permits on file, and I've never had a single violation or complaint from any official agency. The problem started when the neighbor moved in last year. This guy bought the adjacent 5-acre property that the previous owner had used as a weekend retreat. The old owner was great, minded his own business, and actually appreciated having a working ranch next door. But when he sold to this new neighbor, everything changed. This new neighbor was clearly what you'd call new money. He drove an expensive truck that never had a speck of dirt on it and wore designer boots that looked like they'd never touched actual soil. He'd moved out from the city and apparently thought owning a piece of rural land automatically made him some kind of rancher. The reality was that he just complained about everything. The complaints started almost immediately after he moved in. First, it was about the noise from my tractor. I was doing routine maintenance on the fencing on a Tuesday morning around 11 a.m., which is perfectly reasonable for ranch work. The neighbor marched over to the property line and started yelling about how the tractor was disturbing his peaceful rural experience. I explained politely that this was a working ranch and that agricultural activities were protected under the right to farm laws in our area. The neighbor didn't like that answer one bit. He went on about how he'd paid good money for his property and shouldn't have to listen to industrial equipment during his morning coffee. Next came complaints about the smell of the animals. Keep in mind the sheep pasture is over 300 yards from his house, and I only keep about 30 head. It's not exactly a massive commercial operation, but according to the neighbor, the smell was overwhelming and ruining his quality of life. He demanded that I move the animals to a different part of the property or get rid of them entirely. I tried to explain that the animals had been grazing in the same area for years and that the previous neighbor had never complained. The sheep were healthy, well-maintained, and the pasture was in excellent condition. But the new neighbor wasn't interested in reason. He just kept insisting that I should accommodate his preferences. The final pre-tank complaint was about the look of my barn. This is a functional agricultural building that's been on the property for decades. It's not falling down or unsafe, just has that weathered look that working barns develop over time. The neighbor claimed it was bringing down his property value and suggested that I should either renovate it to look more aesthetically pleasing or tear it down entirely. I was getting pretty tired of these complaints, but kept trying to be reasonable. I explained the right to farm protections again and pointed out that the neighbor had purchased property next to an active agricultural operation. If he wanted suburban aesthetics, he probably should have bought in a subdivision instead of rural land. These conversations only seemed to make the neighbor more hostile. He started making veiled threats about calling various government agencies and mentioned several times that he had connections who could make my life difficult. I wasn't particularly worried since everything on the property was legal and properly permitted, but it was clear that this neighbor was going to be a long-term problem. The situation escalated when the neighbor developed an obsession with my water tank. His property sits slightly downhill from mine, and somehow he got it into his head that the tank was stealing his groundwater. This shows a fundamental misunderstanding of how water systems work, but the neighbor was convinced he was right. The first direct confrontation about the tank happened on a Saturday morning when I was checking the pump equipment. The neighbor came walking up to the fence line and started shouting about how my massive tank was siphoning his well dry and that it was illegal. I tried to explain basic hydrology to him. The tank is a storage system, not a drilling operation. Water gets pumped from my permitted well into the tank for distribution around the property. It's a completely closed system that doesn't affect neighboring groundwater any more than filling a swimming pool would. The neighbor wasn't having it. He claimed he'd been researching and that I was draining the aquifer. He threatened to report me to the water board and seemed to think this would be some kind of devastating blow. I actually appreciated the suggestion and called the water board proactively to make sure everything was still in compliance. The inspector who came out confirmed that my well permit was current, the usage was well within legal limits, and there were no violations whatsoever. The neighbor's complaint was officially dismissed as unfounded. When I informed the neighbor about the water board's findings, it only made him angrier. He claimed the inspection was rigged and that I must have bribed the inspector. He started talking about conducting his own investigation and gathering evidence of my water theft. This is where things should have ended, but the neighbor apparently took this rejection as a personal challenge. Over the next few weeks, I noticed him walking the fence line near the tank area at odd hours. He seemed to be studying the setup and taking photos from his side of the property line. I mentioned this to a friend who suggested installing some security cameras, but at the time it seemed like overkill. The tank area was fenced off with a basic chain link fence and a simple padlock. It never occurred to me that someone would actually break in. That turned out to be a serious miscalculation. The incident happened on a Tuesday morning in early March. I had gotten up before sunrise to check on a ewe who was close to lambing. After confirming she was doing fine, I grabbed a cup of coffee and headed out to check the water levels and make sure all the automatic systems were functioning properly. As I walked toward the utility area, something sounded wrong. Instead of the usual quiet hum of the pump system, there was a hissing noise and some kind of metallic clanking that definitely shouldn't have been there. I rounded the corner of the barn and stopped dead. The gate to the water tank enclosure was wide open and the padlock was lying on the ground in pieces. Someone had clearly cut it with bolt cutters, but that wasn't even the worst part. The neighbor was inside the fenced area, standing next to the tank with a large pipe wrench in one hand and his smartphone in the other. He was actively unscrewing the main drainage valve at the base of the tank, and a massive torrent of water was gushing out onto the concrete pad and turning the surrounding area into a muddy mess. The neighbor was filming the water as it poured out, apparently documenting what he thought was evidence of some kind of violation. The drainage valve is designed for emergency situations and maintenance, not casual use. Opening it without proper preparation creates exactly the kind of flooding that was happening. I shouted at him, demanding to know what he was doing. The neighbor looked startled for a moment, but then recovered with an incredible display of arrogance. He claimed he was conducting a citizen's inspection, and that he'd discovered my tank was faulty and leaking. He was documenting this massive violation for the county. I pointed out that the neighbor was the one causing the leak by opening the valve. The neighbor insisted that he had a right to inspect what he called a clear hazard and claimed this was evidence of my illegal water hoarding. He said he was stopping the problem from damaging his property. At this point, I realized that arguing with this guy was pointless. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started recording. I stated clearly for the camera that the neighbor was trespassing on private property, had broken the lock, and was destroying my equipment. I announced that the sheriff was being called immediately. The neighbor's face showed some uncertainty when he realized he was being recorded, but he doubled down on his story. He told me to go ahead and call the authorities because they would see what a criminal I was. I called 911 and explained the situation to the dispatcher. Within about 15 minutes, a sheriff's deputy arrived. The neighbor, who was now covered in mud from the flooding he'd created, immediately ran up to the deputy's car. The neighbor launched into his victim routine, telling the officer that I was illegally draining the aquifer and that the tank was faulty and flooding the area. He claimed he'd just been documenting the problem before it caused a landslide on his property. The deputy was a no-nonsense local guy who'd probably seen his share of property disputes. He looked at the neighbor, then at the gushing water, then at me, standing calmly with a phone in hand. I walked over and explained what had actually happened. I showed the deputy the cut lock, pointed to the wrench the neighbor had dropped, and estimated that at least 200 gallons of water had been dumped. Most importantly, I had video evidence of the neighbor admitting he was conducting an inspection. The deputy asked to see the video, and I played it back for him. The audio was crystal clear. You could hear the neighbor explicitly saying he was conducting a citizen's inspection, which directly contradicted his emergency response story. The deputy sighed and looked at the neighbor with obvious frustration. He told the neighbor that he'd admitted to trespassing and vandalism and that he was under arrest. As the deputy was putting handcuffs on him, the neighbor started screaming about how this was all wrong and that he was the victim. He kept yelling that his lawyer would destroy me and that I would regret this. After the deputy left with the neighbor in custody, I was left with a huge mess to clean up. The first priority was getting the drainage valve closed, which took some effort since the neighbor had loosened it so much. Then I had to assess the damage and start documenting everything for insurance and potential legal action. The flooding had created a massive muddy area around the tank pad. Some of the mud had flowed toward the fence line, and I was concerned it might actually reach the neighbor's property and give him something legitimate to complain about. Fortunately, the slope worked in my favor, and most of the water soaked into the ground before reaching the property line. I called a local water company to get a certified estimate of the cost to replace 200 gallons of treated, filtered well water. It might not sound like much, but when you factor in the energy costs for pumping, filtering, and the wear and tear on the equipment, it added up to a significant amount. I also got quotes from a security company for upgraded locks and a high-definition camera system aimed at the tank area. If the neighbor was willing to break in once, there was no reason to think he wouldn't try it again. True to his word, the neighbor hired a lawyer. I was served with paperwork for a countersuit about 2 weeks after the incident. The neighbor's legal strategy was apparently to claim that my tank represented a public hazard and that the neighbor had acted as a good Samaritan. According to the court filing, the neighbor's lawyer claimed that the neighbor had observed a dangerous leak from his own property and had bravely entered my land to perform an emergency shut-off and document the environmental hazard. The filing painted the neighbor as a concerned citizen trying to protect the community from my negligent water management. It was a complete fabrication, but it was also a serious legal threat. I realized this wasn't going to be settled with a simple conversation and hired a lawyer to handle both the defense against the countersuit and a civil claim for damages. My lawyer filed a comprehensive lawsuit seeking reimbursement for the water loss, the damaged lock, the security upgrades, and legal fees. The lawyer also pointed out that the neighbor's actions constituted criminal trespassing and vandalism, which were matters of public record since he'd been arrested. The legal process took several months, during which the neighbor seemed to think he was going to win. I occasionally saw him near the fence line, apparently taking more photos and measurements. I was glad to have installed the security camera system, which captured several instances of the neighbor lurking around the property line at odd hours. The neighbor also started spreading stories around the community about my illegal water operation and environmental violations. Fortunately, most of the local residents knew me and understood that this was just a dispute between neighbors. The fact that all of my permits were properly filed and up to date helped establish credibility. The court date was finally set for a Tuesday morning in late August. I arrived at the courthouse with my lawyer and all the documentation we'd gathered. The neighbor showed up with his lawyer and what appeared to be a thick folder of evidence. The proceedings took place in a small claims courtroom since the dollar amounts involved weren't huge. The judge was a practical, experienced person who'd obviously dealt with plenty of property disputes over the years. The neighbor's lawyer presented his case first, sticking to the Good Samaritan story. He showed the court the video the neighbor had taken of the water gushing out, describing it as proof of the massive leak his client had discovered. The lawyer argued that the neighbor had potentially saved the community from an environmental disaster, and that I should be grateful rather than vindictive. The presentation was polished and professional, and I had to admit it sounded convincing if you didn't know the real story. The neighbor's lawyer made it sound like his client was a heroic environmental activist who'd risked his own safety to address a public hazard. Then it was my lawyer's turn. Instead of a long presentation, my lawyer simply set up a laptop and played my video for the court. The recording was damning. You could clearly hear me asking what the neighbor was doing, and the neighbor's response was unambiguous. He stated that he was conducting a citizen's inspection and that he'd suspected the tank was faulty. There was no mention of emergency response or environmental protection. The judge leaned forward and asked the neighbor's lawyer a simple question. Had his client said he was conducting a citizen's inspection, or had he said he was performing an emergency shutoff? The audio was quite clear. The neighbor's lawyer tried to argue that his client had been under duress and hadn't expressed himself clearly. The judge wasn't buying it. In a moment that I will never forget, the judge actually laughed out loud. Not a polite chuckle, but a genuine disbelieving laugh. The judge pointed out that the neighbor had brought his own pipe wrench to this supposed emergency response. If he'd really discovered a leak and wanted to help, why hadn't he simply knocked on my door or called the authorities? At this point, my lawyer presented the itemized damage list. The cut padlock, the cost of the wasted water, my legal fees for defending against the baseless countersuit, and the full invoice for the new security gate and camera system. The neighbor's lawyer objected to the camera system, arguing that it was an upgrade rather than a replacement and that I was trying to profit from the situation. The judge shut that down immediately. The neighbor's actions had made the security upgrade a necessary expense. I was entitled to take reasonable measures to prevent future incidents, and the neighbor's criminal behavior had directly caused that need. The final verdict was everything I could have hoped for. The judge awarded full damages for the water, the lock, my legal fees, and the entire security system. The judge also imposed a fine for criminal trespassing and made it clear that any future incidents would result in much more serious consequences. The neighbor's face during the verdict was something to see. He'd clearly expected his expensive lawyer and elaborate story to carry the day. Instead, his own recorded words had destroyed his case completely. I received a check from the neighbor's lawyer about 3 weeks later. The total amount was substantially more than I had initially expected, thanks to the legal fees and the comprehensive security system. It felt good to be compensated for all the time and stress the neighbor had caused. The new security camera system was installed shortly after, providing crystal clear coverage of the tank area and the fence line. The camera has night vision capabilities and sends alerts to my phone whenever there's movement in the area. So far, the only visitors have been the occasional deer. But the best part came when I decided what to do with the last $50 of the settlement money. I commissioned a small, professionally engraved brass sign from a local trophy shop. The sign was mounted on the new security gate, facing outward toward the property line, where it's clearly visible from the neighbor's backyard. The sign reads, "Private property, inspected once, paid twice." Every time the neighbor goes into his backyard, he gets to see a reminder of his expensive mistake. I taught him a lesson he won't forget, and came out on top financially. The neighbor has been remarkably quiet since the court case concluded. No more complaints about tractor noise, animal smells, or building aesthetics. He seems to have finally learned that my property rights are not negotiable and that his urban expectations don't override agricultural law. My relationship with the other neighbors in the area has actually improved since word of the case got around. Several people have mentioned that they'd been dealing with similar harassment from this guy and were glad to see him finally face some consequences. The whole experience taught me some valuable lessons about documenting everything and not assuming that reasonable people will behave reasonably. The security camera system has already paid for itself in peace of mind, and the legal precedent should discourage future problems. Most importantly, my ranch operations continue without interference. The sheep are healthy, the orchard is producing well, and the water system works exactly as it's supposed to. The neighbor learned that his money can't buy him the right to dictate how other people use their property, and I learned that sometimes the best way to deal with bullies is to let them destroy themselves. The brass sign is still there, polished and gleaming in the sun. I like to think it serves as an educational reminder for anyone else who might consider overstepping boundaries. Some lessons are worth the cost, and this neighbor definitely got his money's worth. The next one is a malicious compliance story. Hey all, friendly neighborhood trash panda here. The giant kind, not the bandit kind, it'll make sense in a minute. Backstory. I work as a sanitation engineer with a primary focus on residential communities. I'm a garbage collector for houses, see? It makes sense now. Our collection is handled automatically. Our trucks have a hydraulic grabber that we control from inside the cab to grab carts and dump them into the truck. We generally do not need to get out of the truck. We're not manually lifting and tossing garbage. It's a pretty easy gig. What most people don't realize is the rules for garbage collection. There are a lot of rules placed on homeowners, residents. What materials are acceptable, size limitations, if your garbage bin lid isn't fully closed, and a big one is bin placement. All bins need to be 1 meter away from basically anything else, parked vehicles, other bins. This is to ensure ease of using the hydraulics to grab the bins and also to prevent possible damage like scraping someone's car or busting a headlight or something. Generally, this isn't an issue in that, with a bit of practice, you get good at grabbing bins even if they're parked right beside each other, or we'll just hop out of our truck, move the bin a little so it's easy to grab, and then move it back. Reasoning for this is 1, we're not a-holes, and it's just the nice, neighborly thing to do since myself and most of my colleagues live in the same community we work. And 2, it's actually a lot of paperwork for us to fill out for violations, so it's significantly easier to just take the 30 seconds to move the bin than the 5 minutes to do all the paperwork to issue a violation ticket. Story. We service a community that does both garbage and recycle on the same day. 2 bins, 2 trucks, 2 drivers. Most residents will put both bins side by side touching each other, a violation. So what we'll do is whichever truck gets to the location first will grab their bin, dump it, then move it maybe a foot or 2 away from the other driver's bin so the second driver has an easier time grabbing it. It saves time for us and makes things run smoother. And we don't get complaints from people until we do. A resident complained that we were moving her bins, and word traveled to the higher-ups. Myself and my colleague got disciplined, instructed to place his bins back exactly where we got them from, and then were monitored via our dash cams for a few weeks to ensure compliance. An out supervisor would take a trip out to the specific resident who complained after our shift to ensure the bins were not moved. Not appreciated being discipled so severely because some fat cow had to take 2 extra steps to get one of her bins. We complied to the letter with her request. Unfortunately for her, she had a habit of placing her bins side by side, which is a spacing violation. So for 2 months, every week we would get to her residence, bins are side by side so we can't grab them due to not enough space, fill out paperwork for a violation and place the violation ticket on her bins, and not dump her bins. She finally got the hint after about 2 months and started spacing her bins 3 feet apart and never complained about us moving her bins again. She also had to pay several small fees for extra pickup, since by the time she figured it out, she had several bins full of garbage and regulations, or 1 bin dump per resident. Anything extra is a not insignificant fee per extra bag. The next one is an entitled people story. I remember this like it was yesterday. May end up longer than I expect with typos because I just woke up. Sorry in advance. Anywho, I did all my due diligence to have my son's 5th birthday party under shaded benches at a public park. These are first come first serve, but can also be rented. I wanted to do a bouncy castle too and had to get a city permit to allow it. I reserved my 2 rows of benches under the 6-row awning and got there at 6 a.m. to make sure I got an end row for easier access cause kids party, and secured my 2 rows of tables. Another guy came setting up for his 1-yo birthday and starts putting up ribbon and balloons and tablecloths on the 2 tables behind me. This guy then asked me if I could watch his stuff real quick while he goes to the store for ice or something he forgot. I don't remember exactly, but I say sure, I got nothing other to do while I sit at the park and wait till noon for the party to start. I did have my son with me because he wanted to come and play at the park and run around while we waited. This is important for the next part here. So next thing I know, my son is hysterically crying, running towards me. I'm freaking out because of his screams of terror. So a lady with her infant and toddler were at the playground and she had a puppy on leash. My son was running to the swings, and the dog was able to lunge out and bite him on the arm. He had a good puncture wound. So first I assess him, he's okay, then go to find said dog cause WTF. Why bring aggressive dog to park with kids running around? She never bothered to come to me either. I had to go to her and she was rushing to leave. It was a puppy. He had his shots ECT. I was pissed, but her apologies and look of remorse led me to move on. His wound wasn't worth a doctor trip, it was minor, and she actually had shot records and we exchanged numbers, so I let it go. Thought that's the worst that will happen today. I was so very wrong. So me and my boy go back to the tables, and this new lady, we will call her EL, has arrived and was ripping all the decorations off the tables. The guy asked me to watch. I confront her and she says she reserved the tables and we all have to move. I let her know I too reserve tables and only 2 rows can be reserved, and any that aren't are first come first serve, and that guy was here, just went to grab something. With all the chaos of my son's ordeal, that was around the time the guy got back. I apologized for EL and his decorations he's pulling out of the trash. She's pissed because she thought she got all 6 rows of tables. The insults start flying at this guy from her and the small group that showed up with her. I actually showed her the spot on our permits where it states 2 tables. She's pissed but kinda lets it go. That is until the bounce house guy gets there to set up. EL comes stomping over to me. You can't have that here. Me, yes you can. You just have to get a city permit, which I did. EL, no. I called the park, they said you can't. Me, yes you can. It even on their website, you have to get a city permit, which was like 100 to be able to set one up, and I did that. She wanted to see said permit, but was being very rude from the get-go, so I said I don't have to prove crap to you, lady. Now, parties are in full swing and she keeps trying to send her kids to our bouncy house. I tell her sorry, but I can't permit that. If one of your kids gets hurt, I would be liable, so hard pass. I didn't, but should have mentioned if she wasn't a total idiot to everyone, maybe it would be a different story. Anyhow, this makes her over the top mad and EL, and her group starts hurling insults and racial slurs towards the middle table. She was more mad at me, I think, but they were closer, so they got her rage. Anywho, EL and her entitled man get really nasty, and next thing I know, there's a full-blown fist fight between EL's baby shower group and a 1-yo birthday party group. The groups weren't going at it, pretty sure it was the husbands, but still, cops are called, kids are scared. I walk over and said I'd give a statement to police as the guy next to us didn't start it and did. Surprisingly, no one went to jail. Of course, EL had police come check I had proper permits, and when all my stuff stayed because it was all legal, she finally backed down and no more insults, but damn, the death stares I got from any of her group the whole time was crazy, so it was both a party from hell and one we will never forget. Thanks for reading. We all laugh about his crazy party now, he's 19. editing to add because apparently I need to explain myself. I think the whole thing is a ridiculously funny story now of my son's disaster birthday that year. I have ADHD unmedicated by choice. I've become one in my 47 years with my squirrel brain. I probably do need therapy, but I don't even have time or effort to make necessary doctor appointments half the time, and not due to this incident, I might add. That's just F-can hilarious to me. Also, so sorry, not about posting something that happened 14 years ago, and when I first woke up, I saw something that triggered this in my brain, and though, ooh shiny, let me post this while I remember, because I thought it fit the community. I would have posted it then if Reddit existed. Anyway, thank you for watching.